Eason, and to our program participants, and particularly Director of YPD and our YPD President who's here with us on the podium, and everyone in their respective places, all of our officers, our soldiers, our friends. It is good for us to be here. My message this morning comes from the text that was read, Luke 2:41-52, looking at selected verses. Let us pray. Dear God, we come before you this morning just to give you thanks for the opportunity to be in your presence and in your house one more time. Look upon us today as we open ourselves to receive fresh manna from on high. Look upon Erma Croom, God, your handmaiden. Pour Erma Croom out. Pour yourself in. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my redeemer. I want to acknowledge also our choir this morning. Amen. Let's give them a hand. And our young people, all of them, our dancers, let's give them a hand this morning. Our text this morning, the selected verse that I want to lift up for your hearing is Luke 2:46 and 47. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And I want to talk to you just briefly from the thought this morning. The topic is finding Jesus in unexpected places. But I want to talk to you from a subtopic this morning, living in the questions. Living in the questions. Our text this morning takes us to a transitional period in Jesus' life when his mother and father frantically search for him. The biblical story tells us that Jesus goes with his parents on their customary trip to Jerusalem for the Passover. Yeah. At the time of their search for Jesus, he's no longer the infant the shepherds and the wise men sought for and found. Jesus is now an adolescent. He has reached the stage of his development where he must now learn what it means to take on adult responsibility. We find Jesus at a point in his life where he's wrestling with the stirrings of his own identity. And some of you young people may be also wrestling with who you are and who you are becoming.
That's right.
Seemingly, as a way of stretching the boundaries of his journey to manhood, Jesus spends an unapproved 3 days away from his parents in the company of teachers. Right. Now, many of us can relate to the feeling of horror and dread experienced by his parents in their frantic search for their son. Oh, yes. We can understand their bewilderment at his detached explanation. Those reading or hearing this story would probably recognize somewhat of a rebellious tendency in the adolescent Jesus.
Well, all right.
Now, some of us may recall with a bit of humor now our own demonstration of independence from our parents' rule of authority. Or we may even reflect on, with a degree of painful recollection of the experience of getting into trouble with our parents. Now, some of us, like me, for instance, were given clear indicators by our parents of the degree of trouble we were in. For instance, when my mother called me by my middle name, which is Yvette, I had an inkling that my experience when I encountered her would be somewhat unpleasant. However, when she summoned me with the words, "Miss Yvette," a greater degree of anxiety came over me because it meant that I was in big trouble for sure. Now, although this story may awaken in us memories of our adolescent years or the adolescent years of our children or the adolescent years that you may be living right now, it behooves us to explore the story for its deeper meaning for our own lives and as people of faith. Perhaps we can understand this story, first of all, from the perspective of where Jesus is found. At the beginning of the story, Jesus is found in the synagogue, in the house of God. In many ways, the role that the synagogue played in the religious life of the early Jewish community is not unlike the role that the early black church played in the religious life of the African American community. The synagogue was at the center of the religious and social life. It was a place of learning. It was a schoolhouse. It was community gathering. It was a place of prayer. It was a place where community disputes were also mediated. It was also a place where small study groups of Jewish students assembled to read the scripture and discuss the Torah and oral traditions. And here in our text this morning, we find Jesus in God's house. Jesus arrives among a people living under Roman occupation, and they are waiting in anticipation of the coming Messiah. Jesus' presence in the temple was an indication that help was on the way. Amen. A new age was beginning. The arrival of Jesus on the scene meant that meant an abrupt ending of the things as they were. Now, sometimes it seems like God is slow or is late in acting in our behalf. But how many of you know this morning that God is always on time? Somebody said he may not come when you want him, but he's always on time. Perhaps someone this morning is feeling discouraged because it seems like things are never going to change. You think that things are not going to get better. Perhaps you feel like giving up. To you, I say this morning, don't give up, because Jesus is in the house this morning. Therefore, help is on the way. The very significance of our gathering in this house of faith this morning is that it provides us with an opportunity to rekindle hope. For it reminds us that there is an ultimate reality that supersedes the temporal reality. All right. And thus the final word about anything going on in the world or in our community or in our lives rests not with humanity, but with God. God, the Alpha and the Omega. God, the beginning and the end. God. And the rest is God. Perhaps this morning we're invited to understand the story from the standpoint of Jesus' questions. In our text, Jesus is coming of age, entering into his teens, and is an eager student questioning his teachers. As I studied and reflected on this text in preparation for this morning's message, I was struck by the suggestion in one interpretation of the text. In this interpretation, Jesus' encounter with the wise teachers in the temple courts was unusual, not so much because of his age, but because of the wise questions he asked. One of the many things Jesus did throughout his earthly ministry, and you may recall this, was to ask a lot of questions. And we see the beginning of this inquisitive nature in this text. We recall that in response to his parents' inquiry, we hear the young Jesus saying to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house, that I must be about my Father's business?" simply for information, not that he just needed to know. Jesus' questions were piercing. They were compelling. His questions challenged people to look within themselves, within their own hearts and souls. I'm learning that it is the exploration of the questions that we bring to life and to our particular circumstance that adds the most richness and meaning to our lives. Yeah. Our questions also open us up to the wonder and the adventure of life. Yeah. The poet Rilke wrote, "Live the questions now." He went on to say, perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live yourself into the answer. Maybe this morning our text is an invitation for us to live the questions. Rilke's words suggest that living the questions expands us, makes us open to new possibilities. Therefore, living the questions that emerge out of the particulars of our situations and circumstances can be a catalyst for change. It may also foster creative genius and innovation. It can help us live more authentically and purposefully. Our encounter with Jesus is also an indication for us today, just as much as it was for the people of his day, that humanity is not left alone to grapple with its questions. It conveys to us that God's help is always available for us here and now. Help is on the way. Amen. Finally, we may understand the text from the perspective of Jesus' ministry and mission. The text helps us to understand that God, who works in and outside of time, was at work through and in the life of Jesus to extend God's liberating love, forgiveness, and grace to all humanity. Therefore, in the gospel, we find Jesus ministering to the demon-possessed, relieving them of their suffering. We find him among the sick, making them whole. We find him among the corrupt, tax collectors, outcasts, marginalized, and oppressed, uplifting them and changing their lives. Jesus goes to the most discriminated people, the grown-up Jesus, to the forgotten, to the least of these among us. People like those spoken of by Howard Thurman in his pivotal work, Jesus and the Disinherited. We find Jesus among those living with their backs against the wall. He sits down to eat with publicans. He touches and heals the leper. And he seeks out and saves those who are alienated and separated from God. Amen. Oh, bless his holy name. Jesus demonstrated through love and compassion that the heart of God is pained to see people suffering, abandoned, lonely, weary, and abused by life. The good news of Jesus, and I'm talking about the good news this morning, is that the kingdom of God is here right now. And because the kingdom of God is here, in our time, we as people of faith must bring to this text our own questions regarding our identity and calling. Who are we? And who in these turbulent times is God calling us to be? Amen. Who are we to be in the face of mass incarceration? In the wake of the humanitarian crisis at our border, and conditions of homelessness, hopelessness, and despair? Who are we to be to those who are feeling isolated and alone because of mental illness? Those who are alienated and confused? Who are we to be to those who are disconnected from God, from themselves, and from each other? Amen. In essence, what is to be our response as people of faith to those who are hurting today? How may we respond creatively and effectively to the needs of the hurting among us? The Word of God conveys that God is at work in the world, in and through the people of God, infused and empowered by the Spirit of God. We as humans are to participate with God in God's co-creative process as vessels God uses to bring healing, wholeness, and transformation in our community and in our world. And we launch these endeavors by surrendering ourselves to God so that God can use us anytime, any day, anywhere. Hallelujah. Today's text is an invitation to open ourselves up to the whole expanse of God's transformative presence and power. To open our hearts and minds to new possibilities that exist for all of us in God, the young and the not so young. Our text confirms that if we look for Jesus, if we seek him, we will find him this morning. We will find Jesus still speaking words that are life-giving and life-affirming in a climate that is death-dealing. In a society where the promotion of fear, hatred, and bigotry seems to dominate, we find Jesus calling us to a life of faith, a faith that involves stepping out of our comfort zones and trusting God fully with the next step, even though we don't know where that next step will lead. It's about faith. Amen. In this Christmas season we are still in, we are reminded that Jesus is the Emmanuel. He is God with us. The message of Christmas tells us that we don't have to look very far to find Jesus. We only need to dig down in our deepest questions and longings. The gospel message confirms that God is very near to us, right where we are. We need to only open ourselves up to God's awesomeness and mystery. God is with us in the midst of our joys and in our sufferings, triumphs and tragedies of everyday life. God's presence means we are not alone in our trials. We are not alone in our suffering. We're not alone in our difficulties. And therefore, we can live each day in anticipation and hope. Help is on the way because Jesus is in the house this morning. I don't know about you, but it makes a difference to believe that Jesus is here. That Jesus is in the house. The fact that he is present with us and that he's moving among us and stirring within us by the Holy Spirit is important to me, and I'm sure it's important for you this morning. There was, I believe for many of you, or if not all of you, an anticipation that when you walk through those doors that God would meet you here and God would meet you right where you are. And the thing that about that, the fact that Jesus is here this morning is the fact that we don't have to leave here the same way we came. Hallelujah. We don't have to leave here the same way we came. Jesus is in the house. I heard the voice of Jesus say, one hemologist wrote, "Come unto me and rest. Lay down thy heavy one, lay down. Thy weary one, lay down thy head upon my breast." I came to Jesus as I was. Weary waters, and that's my testimony. I found in him a resting, and he has made me. I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Behold, I feel again. The living water, thirsty one. Stoop down and drink." And then I came to Jesus. Hallelujah. I came to Jesus. Oh, and I drank of that life-giving stream. My thirst was quenched. My soul revived. And now, hallelujah, I live. Hey, I live question.
Y'all, come on, let's bless the Lord. Everybody was blessed by the word today. Hallelujah. Finding Jesus in unexpected places. Let me